The wind cut like a blade through the open platform, sharp enough to make grown men hunch their shoulders and turn their faces away. Snow drifted sideways, thin as ash, settling on the rails and the wooden bench that faced the tracks. Most folks had already gone, boots crunching toward warm lamps and closed doors. The last train had not yet arrived, but the station felt forgotten, as if the town itself had drawn a line and stopped caring what happened beyond it. That was when he saw her. She sat straight on the bench, hands folded over a small leather bag, trying not to shiver. Her coat was thin, better suited for fall than for a winter night like this. A wool cap hid most of her hair, but a few strands escaped and clung to her cheek, wet with melting snow. Her eyes were wide and steady, the kind of eyes that had seen hard things and learned to stay open anyway. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply waited, breath slow, jaw set, as if waiting itself were a test she meant to pass. He had come to the station for business, nothing more. Land deeds waited in his coat pocket, papers signed that afternoon with a firm hand and a careful eye. He owned more acres than most men could ride across in a week. Cattle with his brand grazed in valleys that used to scare folks who lacked nerve or money. In town they called him a millionaire cowboy, though he never used the word himself. To him, wealth was quiet. It lived in fences mended on time, in wells that never ran dry, in hands paid fair and treated straight. He noticed the cold first. It worked its way through his gloves and up his arms, reminding him that even a man with money could freeze if he stood still long enough. Then he noticed her again, the way her shoulders tightened when the wind gusted, the way she tucked her chin into her scarf without moving her hands. He slowed his steps, boots soft on the snow, and told himself to keep walking. A man learned early not to pry. Trouble had a habit of sticking to those who asked questions. But the platform was empty now, and the lamps cast long shadows that made the night feel closer. The station door was shut. No conductor stood watch. The town had turned its back. He stopped a few paces away and looked at her face, pale under the gray sky, and something old stirred in him, something he thought years of hard riding and harder deals had worn smooth. She was a nurse, he would learn later, trained in city hospitals where the halls smelled of soap and sorrow. She had come west on a promise that failed her, chasing work that vanished when the man who hired her died before she arrived. The return ticket was beyond her reach. Pride kept her seated when sense said to knock on doors. She believed if she waited long enough, someone would remember her or the morning would come and fix what night had broken. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the cold. She looked up at him then, not startled, just cautious. The kind of caution that had kept her alive through long shifts and longer walks home. He tipped his hat, a small motion, respectful. "You look cold," he said. "I am," she answered. Her voice was steady, low, without complaint. There was no drama in it, and that made him pause. He gestured toward the station door. "The waiting room's closed, but there's a stove inside. I can ask the clerk to open it." She shook her head. "I have waited enough doors," he nodded, as if that settled something between them. He took off his coat then, thick wool lined with years of dust and weather, and held it out. The wind snatched at it, but he held firm. "Take this," he said. "It's colder than it looks." She hesitated, eyes flicking from the coat to his face. "I cannot. You can," he said. "And you will." She did, fingers brushing the heavy cloth, and a breath left her that she had been holding too long. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and the change was immediate. Color crept back into her cheeks. Her hands stopped shaking. "Thank you," she said. He leaned against a post, giving her space. Snow gathered on his hat brim. Somewhere down the line, a whistle sounded, faint and far, not close enough to promise anything. He asked her where she was bound, and she told him the truth, plain as a ledger entry. No job, no ticket. No place to go when the night ended. He listened without interrupting. He had learned that listening was often the kindest thing a man could offer. When she finished, he did not fill the silence with advice. He looked down the tracks and thought of his ranch, the big house built sturdy and warm, the bunkhouse full of men who worked hard and slept deep. He thought of the small clinic in town, understaffed and overrun when winter brought accidents and sickness. He thought of his mother, gone too soon, and the way she used to hum while she worked, as if sound itself could keep fear away. "There's work," he said at last, if you want it. Not charity, work, her eyes narrowed, not in anger but in focus. Doing what? Nursing, he said, for my hands and their families. For the town, if they'll have you? I'll see to the pay, she studied him, measuring the truth of his words the way she measured a pulse. She had seen men make offers that cost them nothing and took everything. She had also seen men who meant what they said and said very little else. And the train, she said. It'll come, he said, morning or night. Either way, you won't be here when it does. The wind rose again, pushing snow across the platform in white sheets. She pulled the coat tighter and nodded once. It was not a surrender. It was a decision. They walked together toward the end of the platform, where his horse waited, steam rising from its nostrils. He helped her up, careful and sure, then mounted behind her, keeping his hands where she could see them. The town watched from behind curtains, already whispering, already shaping the story before it had a chance to breathe. As they rode, the nurse looked back at the station, at the bench where she had waited and the tracks that led nowhere she could afford. She felt fear, yes, but also a strange lift, as if the world had tilted just enough to let her move. The cowboy felt it too, though he did not name it. He only knew that the cold seemed less sharp now, and the road ahead, though dark, felt possible. By morning, the ranch would wake to a new rhythm. By night, the town would have questions. And somewhere between the two, a line would be crossed that neither of them could see yet. A line that would turn a simple act of kindness into a bond strong enough to be remembered long after the snow melted. The train whistle sounded again, closer this time, and the nurse stiffened in the saddle. The cowboy slowed the horse, listening, as if the sound carried a choice. She did not speak. He did not either. The whistle faded into the wind, leaving only the beat of hooves and the weight of what might follow. Neither of them knew that the moment would be tested before dawn, that the town's doubts and the land's demands would press hard against their resolve. They did not know that history often begins in small, cold places with people who think they are only trying to survive the night. As the ranch lights came into view, warm and steady against the snow, she wondered what would be asked of her next. He wondered what it would cost to keep his word. Behind them, the train rolled into the station at last, doors opening to an empty platform, while ahead the future waited, quiet and watchful, ready to see whether they would turn back or ride on. The ranch lights grew larger as they rode, lanterns fixed to posts and windows glowing with a steady amber warmth. Snow lay deep across the yard, smoothed by wind into soft ridges. The nurse watched it all with a careful eye, noting where paths had been broken, where fences stood firm, where a man had planned for winter instead of cursing it. She felt the horse's strength beneath her and the rider's calm behind her, a presence that did not crowd or rush. The cold still bit at her cheeks, but it no longer owned her bones. When they reached the porch, he slid down first and offered a hand. She took it, surprised by the heat of his palm through the glove, surprised too by the way he waited until her boots found solid ground before letting go. Inside, the house smelled of wood, smoke, and clean soap. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the sound alone made her shoulders sag with relief. He hung his hat, set aside his gloves, and pointed her toward a chair near the warmth. "Sit," he said. "I'll bring water." She did, hands spread toward the fire, the coat heavy and comforting around her. She had learned to be alert in new places, but exhaustion pressed in, thick and slow. The man returned with a kettle and a tin cup, poured carefully and set it in her hands. Steam rose. She breathed it in and felt something unclench. "You're safe here," he said, as if stating a fact rather than making a promise. Safe was a word she did not use lightly. It had been thin in her life, easily torn. She nodded anyway. "Thank you." He asked little more that night. He showed her a small room off the hall, simple and clean, with a bed tucked beneath a window. Extra blankets lay folded at the foot. He set a lamp on the table and paused at the door. "We'll talk in the morning," he said. "Get warm. Get rest." When he left, she closed the door and leaned against it, eyes shut. Her breath shook once, then steadied. She washed her hands, the water stinging, and changed into borrowed clothes laid out with quiet care. When she lay down, sleep came fast and deep, but not without shadows. Trains still moved in her dreams, whistles calling from places she could not reach. Morning brought a pale light and the sound of voices outside. She woke to boots on snow, to a low murmur of men greeting one another, to the creak of doors and the thud of wood being stacked. She sat up, heart quick, then slowed herself. This was work beginning, not danger. She dressed, smoothed her hair, and stepped into the hall. In the kitchen, the cowboy stood at the table, sleeves rolled, pouring coffee for two hands who looked worn and grateful. They tipped their hats to her, eyes curious but polite. He introduced her without names, calling her the nurse. The word carried weight. It settled the room. Breakfast was plain and filling. She ate carefully, aware of eyes flicking her way and then away. After, he walked her through the bunkhouse and the barns, explaining in short sentences what he expected and what he would not tolerate. Injuries were common, care was needed, payment would be fair. He spoke of schedules and supplies, of a small room near the house where she could work in quiet when needed. She listened and asked questions that showed she knew her trade. He nodded, satisfied. Still, beneath the surface of the day, something else moved. Men whispered when they thought she could not hear. A woman from town arrived with a child coughing hard and stared longer than necessary. The nurse felt it all and held herself steady. By afternoon, a rider arrived from town with news folded into his coat. The clinic had lost its last trained hand weeks ago. Sickness spread faster in winter. The nurse would be needed there as much as on the ranch. The cowboy listened, jaw tight, and agreed to lend her time. The rider's eyes sharpened at that, measuring what it meant. That evening, as snow began again, the nurse cleaned her tools and thought of the station bench, of the way cold had narrowed her world to a single point. Here, the world widened, but with it came new edges. She caught the cowboy watching her from across the room, not with possession, but with concern, as if weighing costs he had not yet named. Later, when the house quieted, he spoke. "There will be talk. There always is," she said. "They'll say I brought trouble home." She met his gaze. "Did you?" He smiled faintly. "Not yet." Days followed, each one adding weight. She treated frostbite and fevers, mended cuts, and sat long hours with families who had little to give but thanks. The town warmed to her skill, then cooled at her closeness to the ranch. She heard stories in half-sentences, learned which doors stayed shut and which opened only a crack. One night the whistle sounded again, closer than before, and she felt a pull in her chest. The cowboy stood beside her on the porch, both of them listening. "You could go," he said quietly. She did not answer. The train passed without stopping, lights sliding through the snow like a promise that kept moving. When it was gone, the silence felt heavier than before. In the days that followed, a letter arrived with no return name. Its words were few and sharp, warning her away, reminding her of debts she did not owe. She folded it and put it in her pocket, choosing not to show it. The cowboy noticed the change in her, the way her smile held a second longer before settling. He asked once more if she was safe. She said yes because she wanted it to be true. But as winter deepened and the town watched, the space between kindness and consequence grew thin. What had begun on a cold platform now stood under brighter light, and neither of them could tell whether the next sound on the wind would be another train or something far harder to outrun. The letter stayed in her pocket like a stone. Even when she washed clothes and felt it press see-through against the fabric, even when she sat by the fire and the paper warmed with her body heat, it never softened. She told herself it was only words, only someone trying to frighten a woman who had no family close enough to shield her. But winter made every small threat feel bigger, and the ranch sat a long ride from help. The next morning she rode into town with the cowboy in a wagon loaded with grain and medicine tins. Snow squeaked under the wheels. The sky hung low, gray as worn wool. She kept her scarf high, eyes scanning the road. The cowboy watched the land the way men watch for storms, not panicked, just aware. He did not ask about the letter again, but his silence carried a question all the same. In town, folks greeted them with polite faces that did not match their eyes. The nurse worked at the clinic for hours, hands steady as she listened to lungs, cleaned wounds, and wrote careful notes. A few women lingered in the doorway, whispering behind their mittens. She caught phrases as they slipped past her, words like rich rancher, stranger girl, and something about history. It felt too early for history. It felt like the start of a rumor that wanted to grow teeth. Near sundown, as she washed her hands in cold water, the clinic's older midwife stepped close. The woman's hair was silver and braided tight, her hands dry and strong. She spoke low, kind but firm. "Be careful," she said. "This town remembers what it wants to remember." The nurse looked up. "What does that mean?" The midwife hesitated, then sighed. "He has enemies. A man with land always does. But he also has a past people still chew on. They thought he would marry one of their own. They thought money meant he belonged to them." The nurse's fingers tightened around the towel. "I am not here to take anything. That may not matter," the midwife said. "Some folks live on what they imagine." Outside, a group of men stood near the saloon watching the clinic door. The nurse felt their eyes follow her as she stepped into the street. No one blocked her path, but she sensed a line being drawn. The cowboy was already by the wagon, speaking to the grocer. When he saw her face, he cut the talk short and climbed up beside her. They rode home with the sky turning darker by the minute. Halfway down the road, they passed a lone rider coming the other way, head lowered beneath a brim. The rider did not wave. The horse's gait was too careful, like it carried more than a man's weight. The cowboy's hand tightened on the reins. "You know him," the nurse said softly. "I know of him," he answered. That was all he offered, but it was enough to stir unease in her. At the ranch, the hands had gathered by the barn, voices low. One of them stepped forward, a young man with chapped cheeks and anxious eyes. "There was someone near the fence line," he said. "Just after noon. We saw tracks." The cowboy's face stayed calm, but something cold entered his gaze. "Did you follow?" "No," the man said. "You told us not to chase shadows." The cowboy nodded once, approving. He looked toward the dark stretch of land beyond the barn. "Double the lanterns tonight. Keep the dogs close." The nurse listened, chest tight. "Was it a thief?" "Maybe," he said. Then, after a pause, "Or maybe someone who wants to scare me, because of me," she said before she could stop herself. He turned to her. "Not because of you?" "Because I don't bend when they push." That should have comforted her, but it did not. If the trouble was old and deep, then she had stepped into something already burning, and winter wind could make flames travel. That night she could not sleep. The house creaked as it cooled. The fire dropped into coals. She lay still, listening to every sound. At some point, a faint scrape reached her through the window, like a boot dragging on snow. She sat up, heart hammering, and held her breath. A dog barked once outside, then went quiet. The nurse slipped from bed and cracked the door. Down the hall, she saw the cowboy in the lamplight, already awake, coat on, rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He lifted a finger to his lips, telling her to stay quiet. Then he moved toward the back door with slow, careful steps. She wanted to follow, but she forced herself to stay. She knew the difference between courage and foolishness. Still, her hands shook as she waited. Minutes stretched long. Then the door opened again. The cowboy came back in, snow on his boots, eyes darker than before. "Did you see someone?" she whispered. "Tracks," he said. "And a message." He held up a small cloth tied around a fence post. She recognized it at once. It was from her bag, a piece torn from the lining, the color faded but familiar. Her stomach dropped. "They were close enough to touch your things," he said. His voice stayed low, controlled, but the anger in it was real. The nurse swallowed. "Someone followed me, or someone has been watching longer than that," he replied. He set the cloth on the table and stared at it as if it might speak. "Tell me about the letter." She hesitated, shame and fear mixing in her throat. Then she pulled it from her pocket and handed it over. His eyes scanned the words, his jaw tightened. He did not ask who had written it because there was no name, but he seemed to understand the kind of person behind it. "This isn't just talk," he said. "This is warning." The nurse's voice came out thin. "I did not want to cause trouble." "You didn't," he said, firm. "But you're in it now?" He folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket like a man filing evidence. Then he walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard. The lanterns swayed gently in the wind, their light small but stubborn. Beyond them, the land was endless and empty and full of places for secrets to hide. The next day brought new pressures from a different direction. A banker arrived from the nearest city, a neat man with polished boots and a soft hat that did not fit the ranch dust. He asked to see the cowboy and spoke in a voice smooth as butter, praising the ranch, praising the cattle, praising the bright future of railroads and expansion. The nurse served coffee and listened from the doorway while pretending not to. The banker talked about a deal, about a new spur line that could cut through the ranch land, bringing profit, bringing markets closer. He also talked about debts, old and tangled, and hinted that certain papers had been misplaced years ago, papers that could trouble a man's claim if they turned up in the wrong hands. The cowboy's face remained calm, but the nurse saw his knuckles whiten around the mug. "My land is my land," he said. The banker smiled. "Of course. But you know how courts can be, and winter is hard. Accidents happen. People get desperate." The nurse felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She met the cowboy's eyes for half a second. She could see his decision forming, not rash but sharp. When the banker left, the cowboy stood at the window for a long time, watching the wagon roll away. Then he turned to her. "They're squeezing from two sides," he said, "town talk and paper trouble." "Who?" she asked. He shook his head. "If I name them, it gives them power." The nurse wanted to press, but she stopped. She had learned that men like him carried their burdens in silence until they chose to lay them down. Instead, she asked the question that mattered most to her. "Why help me?" she said. "Why not leave me at the station like everyone else?" His gaze softened just slightly. "Because I saw you freezing. Because I know what it is to be alone in a place that doesn't care." She studied him. In the quiet of that room, he did not look like a legend or a millionaire cowboy. He looked like a man who had survived things and built walls only to find someone sitting outside them, shaking with cold. That afternoon, she rode to the clinic alone for the first time, because a child in town had taken a bad fever. The cowboy wanted to come, but a storm was moving in fast, and the hands needed him to secure the cattle. He insisted on sending one of his men to escort her. She refused at first, pride flaring, but when she saw how serious his eyes were, she agreed. The ride felt different with another person beside her. The ranch hand was quiet, respectful, but he watched the tree line like he expected movement. Halfway there, they found the road blocked by a fallen branch. It should not have been there. Not like that, laid across the track in a way that forced them to stop. The hand dismounted, went to move it, and froze. "Ma'am," he said, voice tight. The nurse slid down and stepped close. In the snow beside the branch, someone had carved words with a stick or a knife, shallow but clear enough to read. "Go back." Her breath caught. It was not a prank, it was a command. The nurse looked around. The woods stood still, heavy with snow. No birds, no wind. Only silence and the slow sound of her own heartbeat. The ranch hand moved quickly, pushing the branch aside and urging her to remount. "We keep going," he said. "We don't give them what they want." She nodded, hands stiff on the reins. They rode on, but the message stayed behind them like a shadow on the road. At the clinic, the fevered child lay on a cot, skin hot and eyes glassy. The nurse went to work, mixing cool cloths and careful doses, speaking gentle words to the mother who hovered with desperation in her face. For a while, the work pushed fear aside. It always did. Caring for someone else made her own worry feel smaller. But when she stepped outside after dark, she saw a figure across the street, half hidden by the corner of a building. The nurse's heart lurched. She blinked hard, and the figure stepped back, vanishing into the alley. The ranch hand cursed under his breath and hurried her toward the horse. By the time they reached the edge of town, the storm had arrived. Snow thickened, swallowing the road. The lanterns on porch posts blurred into faint halos. The world narrowed again, just like at the station, and the nurse felt the old fear trying to claim her. Then, through the white curtain of snow, she saw a rider coming fast from the direction of the ranch, riding hard despite the weather. The horse's head was down, fighting the wind. The rider's coat flapped like a dark flag. It was the cowboy. He pulled up beside them, eyes fierce, face set. "Get behind me," he ordered, voice carrying even through the storm. The nurse's throat tightened. "What happened?" He did not answer right away. He glanced back toward town as if expecting someone to appear out of the snow. "Someone broke into the barn," he said at last. "Nothing taken. Just left something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He did not open it, but the nurse saw enough to feel sick. It was her missing ticket stub from the station, the one she thought she had lost in the cold. Her mind raced. Someone had it, someone had saved it. Someone wanted her to know they could reach into her past and pull it out whenever they pleased. The cowboy looked at her, and for the first time she saw fear in him, not for himself, but for what stood between them now. "Tell me everything," he said, voice low and urgent. "Every place you've been, every name you heard. Because whoever is doing this isn't done." The storm raged around them, and the nurse opened her mouth to speak, but at that exact moment, a sharp sound cracked through the wind from somewhere behind, and the horse beneath her jumped hard, nearly throwing her from the saddle. The horse lurched sideways, hooves skidding on packed snow. The nurse grabbed the saddle horn, breath knocked from her chest. The sound came again, sharp and close, then faded into the storm. It could have been a branch snapping under weight or a board striking a fence in the wind, but none of them believed that. The cowboy steadied her horse with a firm hand and guided them forward, his body angled like a shield without making a show of it. They did not stop until the ranch lights broke through the white dark again. Dogs barked, lanterns swung, and men ran out with coats half buttoned. The cowboy spoke fast and low, orders given without panic. The nurse slid down, legs weak, and leaned against the porch rail until her breathing slowed. The ticket stub burned in her mind like a brand. Someone had been close enough to take it. Someone wanted her to know she was not invisible. Inside, the house filled with quiet urgency. Wet coats were hung, boots were stamped free of snow. The cowboy pulled her aside into the kitchen, away from the others. He set a cup of hot tea in her hands and waited until her fingers stopped shaking. "Start from the beginning," he said, "not the station." Before that, she took a breath and told him about the city hospital where she trained, about the ward supervisor who had promised her steady work out west and then vanished. She told him about the man who handled tickets, the one who watched her count her coins twice and smiled like he knew something she did not. She told him about the rooming house where her bag went missing for an hour and came back exactly where it had been. She had thought it was a mistake then. Now she knew better. He listened, eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he nodded once. "There's a pattern," he said. "And it's not just about scaring you. It's about leverage. Against you," she said. "Against my land," he replied. "Against my choices." The weight of that settled between them. She set the cup down. "I can leave," she said, the words tasting like iron. "If that ends it," he shook his head, firm. "They would still push. And I won't let them decide who belongs here." That night he put guards on rotation without calling them guards. He called them watchers. He walked the fence lines himself, boots crunching, breath steady. The nurse stayed awake by the fire, mending bandages and listening to the house. Each creak felt loud, each gust pressed at the windows like a question. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a bright, brittle cold. Tracks crisscrossed the yard where none should have been. The cowboy knelt, studied them, and stood again with a tight look. "They wanted to be seen," he said. Word spread fast. By noon, the town buzzed. Some folks brought casseroles and worried faces, others brought silence. The banker sent another note, polite and thin, asking to meet. The cowboy sent it back unread. The nurse went to the clinic anyway. She refused to be chased from her work. The midwife met her at the door, eyes sharp. "They are watching," she said. "And some are afraid." "Of me," the nurse said. "Of change," the midwife corrected. "And of what it says about them." In the back room a boy lay pale and still, lungs rattling. The nurse worked with steady hands, counting breaths, mixing medicine, speaking calm into fear. Outside, voices rose and fell. At one point, a stone struck the clinic wall, dull and quick. The nurse did not flinch. She had learned to keep going. When she left at dusk, the street felt too open. She held her bag close and walked fast. Halfway to the wagon, a woman stepped out from the doorway, blocking her path. The woman's face was tight with worry rather than anger. "You don't understand," the woman said. "This place does not forgive easily. I am not asking it to," the nurse replied. The woman hesitated, then stepped aside. "Be careful," she said, the words almost a plea. Back at the ranch, the cowboy had gathered his hands in the barn. The nurse stood near the door, listening. He spoke plainly, without stirring speech. He told them someone wanted to scare him into giving up land. He told them he would not. He told them he would protect his own, and he counted the nurse among them without fanfare. No one argued. A few nodded. One man spat into the straw and said, "Then they picked the wrong winter." That night, a fire broke out near the north fence, small but bright against the snow. It did not spread. It did not need to. The message was clear. The cowboy stood with the nurse at a distance, watching the flames die under shovels and snow. "They are running out of tricks," he said. "Or getting desperate," she answered. The next day brought a surprise from the least expected place. The grocer arrived with a folded ledger and a nervous smile. He had found an entry from years back, a sale that did not match the banker's claims. He slid it across the table, hands shaking. "I kept copies," he said. "In case," the cowboy's eyes sharpened. He did not smile, but something eased in his shoulders. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet," the grocer said. "They know I looked." The nurse watched the exchange and felt a spark of hope flicker, dangerous but real. Still, the pressure mounted. A writer delivered a notice stamped with official seals, calling for a hearing in the city within days. Winter travel would be hard. Missing it would be worse. The cowboy decided to go. He would not send a lawyer. He would stand himself. The nurse insisted on coming, not as a shield but as a witness. He argued once, then relented. He trusted her judgment now, and that trust felt like a rope thrown across a gap. They left before dawn, wrapped in wool, breath ghosting in the air. The road was long and empty. At one point they saw a wagon pulled off the trail, wheel broken. They stopped, helped mend it, and moved on. The nurse noticed the way kindness followed him, quiet and constant like a current under ice. In the city, the noise pressed in, sharp and crowded. The hearing room smelled of ink and damp coats. The banker sat at a table with two others, faces smooth. The cowboy stood alone, shoulders square. The nurse sat behind him, hands folded, heart loud. Papers were read, claims were made. The banker smiled. Then the grocer's ledger was brought forward. The room shifted. The banker's smile thinned. More papers followed, pulled from unexpected places by people who had kept them safe. The nurse watched the cowboy's back and felt pride steady her breathing. The hearing stretched on. When it adjourned for the day, nothing was settled. Winter dusk fell early. Outside, a man brushed past the nurse, muttering words she could not catch. She turned, but he was gone. That night, in a rented room with thin walls, the nurse sat by the window and watched the street. The cowboy paced, restless. He stopped and faced her. "If this goes badly," he said, "I want you to know I would do it again." She met his gaze. "I know." The next morning, as they left for the hearing, a crowd had gathered. Some faces were curious, some were hard. The nurse felt eyes on her, measuring. She held her chin high. Inside, the arguments sharpened. The banker pushed harder. The cowboy answered calmly. Then a new voice spoke, unexpected and steady. It was the midwife, called as a character witness, her silver braid bright against her dark coat. She spoke of winters and sickness, of the nurse's work, of lives steadied by her hands. The room listened. Still, the judge called for more time, more review. The waiting stretched again, thin and cruel. Outside, a note was pressed into the nurse's hand as she passed the door. She opened it and felt her blood chill. The words were few. "Leave now." She did not show it to the cowboy. Not yet. She folded it and tucked it away. She would not let fear choose the moment. They returned to the ranch under a sky heavy with promise. Lanterns glowed, dogs ran to greet them. For a moment, the world felt almost normal. Then a rider arrived at speed, hat lost, face pale. "They're at the north fence again," he said. And this time they brought company. The cowboy did not hesitate. He turned to the nurse, eyes fierce and gentle at once. "Stay here," he said. She shook her head. "No." He held her gaze for a heartbeat, then nodded. "Then stay close?" They rode together into the deepening night, the land opening ahead of them, every shadow a question. Somewhere beyond the fence, someone waited, thinking they held all the cards. The nurse felt the weight of the path behind her and the pull of what lay ahead. She did not know how it would end. She only knew she would not step back now. As the wind rose and the lanterns fell behind, The sound of voices drifted across the snow, louder than before, and the nurse tightened her grip, ready for whatever the night demanded. The voices near the north fence grew clearer as they rode, carried on the cold air. They were not shouting, but there was anger in them, the kind that felt practiced. Lantern light bobbed between fence posts, throwing long shadows over the snow. The cowboy slowed his horse and raised a hand. The nurse reined in beside him, heart pounding, but steady. She was afraid, yes, but not frozen. Not anymore. A small group stood by the fence line, bundled against the cold. At their center was the banker, his polished boots already dulled by snow. Beside him stood the lone rider from earlier days, the one who never waved. Two others lingered back, unsure, eyes darting between the ranch and the open land behind them. "You are trespassing," the cowboy said, voice calm and carrying. The banker smiled, thin and tired. "Just talking." "This is still open land, is it not?" "Not this part," the cowboy replied. "And you know it." The nurse watched closely, reading faces the way she read patience. She saw fear beneath the banker's confidence now. She saw uncertainty in the men who followed him. This was not a mob. It was a gamble that had gone too far. The banker shifted his weight. "You have made things difficult," he said. "This could have been settled quietly, by taking what is not yours," the cowboy said. "That is not settling." The banker's eyes flicked to the nurse. "You brought trouble with you," he said, bitterness creeping in. "History will remember that." The nurse spoke before the cowboy could answer. Her voice surprised even her, steady and clear in the night. "History remembers who stood up when it mattered, not who hid behind threats." For a moment no one moved. Then footsteps sounded behind them. More lanterns appeared as ranch hands approached, not running, not shouting, just present. And beyond them, figures from town emerged, drawn by rumor and worry. The midwife was there. So was the grocer. Even the woman who had warned the nurse in the street stood at the edge, arms wrapped tight, watching. The banker's gamble unraveled in the light of witnesses. "You have no claim here," the cowboy said. "And you have pushed far enough?" The banker opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He looked around and saw the shift. The land was not with him. The people were not with him. He gave a short laugh that held no humor. "This is not over," he said. "It is," the cowboy replied. "Because tomorrow the court will finish what it started. And tonight you leave." Silence stretched. The banker nodded once, sharp and stiff. He turned and walked away, his companions following, boots crunching fast, heads down. The lantern light faded with them, swallowed by distance and dark. The nurse let out a breath she did not know she was holding. Her knees felt weak, but she stayed upright. The cowboy looked at her, a question in his eyes. "I'm all right," she said. He nodded, relief softening his face. "Then let's go home." The days that followed moved quickly. The hearing resumed, and this time there were no new tricks. The ledger, the papers, the witnesses all stood firm. The judge ruled in the cowboy's favor, clear and final. The banker did not return to town. When the news reached the ranch, the hands cheered quietly, the way people do when relief outweighs celebration. The nurse felt the tension she had carried for weeks finally loosen. She slept through the night without waking once. Winter began to ease its grip. Snow still fell, but softer now, less sharp. The roads opened. The clinic filled with fewer emergencies and more routine care. The nurse settled into her work with a calm confidence, respected now without question. The whispers faded, replaced by nods and thanks. One afternoon, as she finished bandaging a child's scraped knee, the midwife watched her with a small smile. "You changed this place," she said. "I did not," the nurse replied. "I only did my job." "That is how change usually comes," the midwife said. At the ranch, life found a new rhythm. The cowboy and the nurse shared meals and long talks by the fire. They spoke of small things at first, of weather and supplies, of books read and places seen. Slowly, they spoke of deeper things, of loneliness and hope, of what it meant to choose a place rather than be chosen by it. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the snow with gold, the cowboy led the nurse to the hill overlooking the pastures. The cattle grazed calmly below. Smoke curled from the chimney behind them. "I never planned on history," he said. "I only planned on doing right by what I had." She looked at him, heart full. Sometimes that is enough. He took her hand then, not hurried, not unsure. She felt the warmth of it, solid and real. There were no grand words, no promises spoken into the air, just the quiet understanding that they were walking forward together. Spring came slowly, as it always did. The snow melted into streams that fed the land. The town held a small gathering, nothing official, just neighbors sharing food and laughter. Someone mentioned the story of the freezing nurse at the train station and the millionaire cowboy who stopped. The words sounded larger than the moment had felt, but the nurse smiled anyway. History, she realized, often grew from ordinary kindness. One morning, months later, the sound of a train whistle drifted across the valley. The nurse paused on the porch, listening. The cowboy stepped beside her. "Do you miss it?" he asked. The road. She thought of the station bench, of cold and waiting. She thought of the path that had led her here. "No," she said. "I am where I need to be." The train passed without stopping, a line of motion against the steady land. The nurse leaned into the cowboy's side, and he rested his chin lightly against her hair. They stood there, watching the future move on, content in the present they had built. The ranch thrived. The clinic stood strong. The town, changed in small ways, carried on. And in years to come, when people spoke of that winter, they would not talk first about threats or fear. They would talk about a man who chose compassion over comfort, and a woman who refused to be chased from her calling. They would talk about how love found them in the cold and held fast through every season after. That was the part that made history worth remembering,